Moonshine Life Recipes. Pure corn whiskey. Pure corn whiskey is made from the simple and natural ingredients: corn, malt, water, and yeast. The mash should be composed of 80 to 90% corn with a 10 to 20% adjunct of malt to supply enzymes. Malt enzymes will be explained below and in the chapter on mashing. Ingredients: corn. Corn in most of its forms, e.g. cornmeal, corn flour, flaked maize, can be used to make whiskey. The corn must be top-quality food-grade corn. Any attempts to use cow corn or chicken feed will only produce inferior results, possibly with noxious off flavors due to additives that may be present in the feed. The starches in hard grains such as cornmeal or corn flour require dispersing in the mash water by performing a full boil for about 20 or 30 minutes. This is described in Appendix A. Other mashing methods. However, with flaked maize, which is already dispersed corn that has been hot rolled the way rolled oats are made, the grain starches readily disperse into the 65.50 C. 150 of mash water without the need of boiling. Not having to boil the grain makes for a considerably more convenient mashing process, and for that reason flaked maize has been chosen as the primary form of corn in this text. How to mash other forms of corn as well as other types of grain is described in Appendix A. Flaked maize can be purchased at most health food or bulk food stores. Some such stores don't stock it because the demand for it for home use is fairly low, but most will gladly order it for you since it comes from the same distributors that supply all their other grain products. You may have to ask them to order it anyway even if they do carry it, since you will generally want a 22.7 kg, 50 pounds, bag of it, which is often more than they will have on hand. Ordering it typically takes about a week. It can also be purchased at home brewers' supply shops. At full retail price, flaked maize usually costs a little more than cornmeal, but if you buy a 22.7 kg 50 pounds bag it will be cheaper than the retail price of cornmeal. Malt. The word malt describes a process, as much as it is the name of certain grain products. Any type of grain can be malted. That is, sprouted then kiln-dried to kill the sprouts. When grain is just beginning to sprout, it produces many different enzymes to break down the endosperm, i.e. the large starchy mass in each kernel of grain, to provide food to nourish the rapidly growing grain plant. The sprouts are heated in a kiln at this early stage to kill them and preserve both the enzymes and the endosperm before the young plants consume them. The malt can then be used as a source of enzymes to convert grain starches, including its own, to fermentable sugars in a beer or whiskey mash. Of the many different enzymes produced during malting, the diastatic enzymes, i.e. enzymes that convert starch to sugar, are the most important to mashing. Also of importance to mashing are the protein-degrading enzymes. These produce nutrients that improve yeast performance in the subsequent fermentation step. Most of the common grains, e.g. corn, rye, barley, wheat, are available in malted form, but barley malt is by far the most widely used for making whiskey, and is therefore the choice in this text. The best place to buy barley malt is from home brewers' supply shops. These shops sell many varieties of barley malt, but only certain ones are suitable for making whiskey. First of all, malt extract, available as syrup or powder, has no diastatic enzymes and cannot be used for mashing. Only certain varieties of all-grain barley malts have the diastatic enzymes needed to convert the comparatively large quantities of starches in a whiskey mash to sugar. All-grain barley malts come in different varieties from pale malts to caramelized malts to a full spectrum of roasted malts. Only the pale ale or light lager malts stated to be of high diastatic power are suited to making whiskey. The caramelized and roasted malts have, for all practical purposes, no diastatic power. Fortunately, the above-mentioned pale ale and light lager malts are the main staples of all-grain brewing and are the most abundant varieties stocked by the home brewers' shops. They are usually the least expensive varieties as well. There are two types of high diastatic pale malts, 2-row and 6-row, and most home brewers' shops carry both. 6-row barley malt is well known to have the highest diastatic power. 6-row barley kernels are smaller than 2-row because their endosperms are smaller. Even though the kernels are smaller, each kernel produces the same amount of enzymes as larger kernels. With smaller kernels, there are more kernels per kilogram of malt, and therefore more enzymes per kilogram. However, this is no longer of concern. The well-modified high diastatic 2-row pale malts made nowadays have very nearly the same diastatic power as the 6-row malts and work just as well for making whiskey. A lot of home brewers' shops also carry wheat malt and rye malt among their malt selection. These malts tend to be of high diastatic power and are well suited to whiskey making. Their use will not be covered in this book, but they can be substituted unit for barley malt in any of the procedures described in the following chapters. After you are comfortable with the processes of whiskey making, it is worthwhile experimenting with different grain malts. One last word about malt is the crush. In order to mash with malted grains, they have to be crushed with a grain grinder. Nearly all home brewers' shops will crush the grain for you, or avail you of an on-premise grinder you can use to crush the malt you are buying. Beer mash requires sparging, i.e. a process of rinsing the sweet liquid from the spent grains after the starch conversion is complete. In order to sparge, the grain must form a filter bed that is loose enough to allow the liquid to pass through it. This requires a fairly coarse crush. Whiskey mash doesn't require sparging, so the crush can be much finer. A finer crush exposes slightly more of the enzymes and starch to the mash and is therefore beneficial. If the grain grinder is adjustable, adjust it for a fairly fine crush. If it's not adjustable, as a lot of roller mills aren't, the regular brewer's grind will work just fine. Water. The Scots and the Irish have maintained for centuries that the secret to making good whiskey lies in the mash water used. Modern science has revealed that the characteristics of the mash water are not only important to the quality of the whiskey, but some, e.g. iron content and pH, are pivotal to the function of the malt enzymes. The water used must be very nearly devoid of iron. A high iron content will denature, i.e. destroy, the enzymes. On the other hand, a fairly high calcium content, 50 to 250 parts per million, ppm, is beneficial to the subsequent fermentation and the resulting flavor of the finished whiskey. Sulfates are preferable to carbonates or bicarbonates, but all are acceptable in the process. If you are adding calcium, explained in the chapter on mashing, choose calcium sulfate, gypsum, over calcium carbonate, precipitated chalk, pH. pH is a measure of the acidity or alkalinity of an aqueous solution, i.e. a solution in water. A pH of 7 is exactly neutral, neither acid nor alkaline, e.g. pure water. A pH below 7 is acidic. The lower the pH, the stronger the acidity. A pH above 7 is alkaline. The higher the pH, the stronger the alkalinity. The full range of the pH scale is from 1 through 14. Malt enzymes will function in a pH from as low as 4.6 to as high as 8.0. However, at the extremes the starch conversion will be very slow and incomplete. The optimum range is from 5.2 to 5.5. but conversion does work very well at 6.0 and even as high as 7.0. Most source waters, even some of the best, will require some pH adjustment. This will be discussed in detail in the chapter on mashing. Very few source waters are too acidic for mashing. Almost all are either close to neutral or are alkaline. Virtually all municipal tap waters are alkaline. Most have a pH between 8 and 9, but some are carefully adjusted to around pH 7.4. If a municipal tap water were even slightly acidic, e.g. pH 6.9, over a period of years the water would corrode the metallic parts in the water distribution system. Because of this, municipal water treatment plants ensure the water is not acidic by passing the water over crushed limestone, which is a crude unrefined form of calcium oxide, CaO. CaO turns to calcium hydroxide, CaOH2, when mixed with water. This process is very cursory and does not offer very precise control over the resulting pH, so the resulting pH typically varies between 8 and 9. Some municipal water treatment plants use purified calcium hydroxide, CaOH2, instead of crushed limestone and adjust the pH to an exact value such as 7.4. Either way, the pH needs adjustment downward for mashing. Most municipal water treatment plants will happily send you a copy of their current water analysis. All you really need to look at is the overall hardness level, iron content, calcium content, and pH. Although hardness, in of itself, is not bad for mashing, it's generally preferable to a fairly soft water, i.e. overall hardness level of 8 or less. Iron content should be very low, if not zero, i.e. less than 25 ppm. A preferred calcium content is between 50 and 250 ppm, but if it's higher this is not a significant concern, and if it's lower gypsum can be added. The pH will invariably be too high, but this can be adjusted as discussed in the chapter on mashing. If suitable source water is not available, you can use deionized or distilled water as sold in pharmacies and supermarkets. It's advisable to add 10 milliliters, 2 teaspoons of gypsum, calcium sulfate, CaSO4, per 20 ml of pure water. This will establish a calcium content of about 150 ppm. In the end, what we are doing here is emulating some variation of the mountain spring waters used to make the world's finest whiskies. Some of the more well-known regions are the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Kentucky, Tennessee, and many other areas in the Appalachian Mountains. Yeast. Yeast is a living organism and is in the mold family of plant cells. The yeast used for fermenting grain mash can be any brewer's yeast. Baker's yeast is simply a form of brewer's yeast, and works just as well. However, commercial whiskey distilleries use specific strains of brewer's yeast, and these strains are closely guarded proprietary secrets. And each whiskey distillery seems to have its own strain. A home brewer can go to a commercial brewery and most breweries will gladly give them a sample of their particular strain of brewer's yeast. But a home distiller cannot seem to get a commercial whiskey distillery to share their proprietary yeast strain. Anyway, Baker's yeast works excellently, and each different strain of pure brewer's yeast, e.g. as produced by Yeast, Brewer's Choice, or Yeast Labs, available at home brewers' supply shops, gives a slightly different nuance or character to the finished whiskey. With one strain of pure yeast, the whiskey will have a distinct nutty character, with another the whiskey will have a creamy flavor, and so on. It's certainly worthwhile experimenting with different strains of brewer's yeast, but until you are thoroughly comfortable with the process, it's highly recommended that you stay with Baker's yeast. Turbo yeasts, over the past 10 years, a series of yeast preparations for home distillers has been introduced called turbo yeasts. Most of these turbo yeasts are produced in Sweden, and they are absolutely excellent for producing pure alcohol for vodka, gin, and essence-based spirits. Turbo yeasts come in packages of 90 to 200 g and are typically formulated to ferment a 25 L batch of straight sugar and water. They usually ferment 5 to 8 K of sugar per batch, and they produce from 13 to 20% alcohol, depending on how much sugar they are designed to ferment. For the 13 to 14% formulations, they ferment in 2 to 4 days. For the higher alcohol contents like 17, 18, and 20%, they take up to 2 weeks. Turbo yeasts are comprised of a high alcohol-tolerant yeast strain mixed with yeast nutrients to supplement the nutrient-lacking sugar and water substrate they are designed to ferment. These turbo yeasts have improved significantly every year since they were introduced about 10 years ago, and it is anticipated that the advancements in genetically engineered yeast strains will open the door to other dimensions of improvements. However, grain mash fermentation has little to gain from turbo yeasts. As mentioned above, turbo yeasts are formulated to ferment very high percentages of alcohol in very nutrient-deficient substrates. Grain mash fermentations are neither high alcohol nor nutrient deficient, and therefore do not need a turbo yeast. It's much like adding chemical fertilizer to watermelons growing in a manure heap. It's great stuff, but they just don't need it. Where to buy yeast? Most people are familiar with buying baker's yeast in supermarkets in small envelopes or jars intended for home baking. But, for the quantities required for making whiskey, this would be a prohibitively expensive way to buy baker's yeast. Baker's yeast can be purchased very cheaply in bulk from a supermarket baking section, delicatessen, health food store, or bulk food store. Most baker's yeast nowadays comes in dried granules called active dried yeast. However, some bakeries still sell it in yeast cakes, which is a wet creamy form that resembles a pound of butter in its packaging. This form doesn't keep nearly as long as active dried yeast, and you have to use 2.5 times as much to get the same number of yeast cells. For example, if a recipe called for 60 g of active dried baker's yeast, you would have to use 150 g of baker's yeast cake. For pure brewer's yeasts, you can buy them at home brewers' supply shops. These yeasts usually come in liquid form in vials or foil envelopes. They are quite expensive and the quantity is usually quite low. In order to use these yeasts, you will have to make a yeast starter to build up the yeast population, as is done for home brewing. This is usually explained on the yeast packaging. For any yeast you are buying, you should always check the use-by date. Expired yeast will not work for fermentation. Calcium sulfate, CaSO4. Calcium sulfate, aka gypsum, is used to increase the calcium content of the mash water. This helps to prepare a mash water that emulates the properties of the mountain spring waters used to make the finest whiskies in the world. Calcium sulfate can be purchased at home winemaking and brewers' supply shops or at chemical suppliers. Glucoamylase. Glucoamylase is a laboratory-prepared enzyme that is used in mashing to reduce, if not eliminate, the proportion of unfermentable sugars in the mash. Mashing using malt enzymes produces a small proportion of unfermentable sugars, dextrins, and polysaccharides. In brewing, these unfermentable sugars are essential to the body and malt character of the beer, but in distilling they only represent lost alcohol yield. By employing glucoamylase, these Unfermentable sugars are converted to fermentable sugars and thereby increase the overall yield. Glucoamylase, as used in the distilling industry, is produced by pharmaceutical companies and is not easily accessible in small quantities by the home distiller. Another form of it is packaged for homebrewers to be used in making dry beer and can be purchased at home brewers' supply shops. It's often just called amylase in these shops. Some home distillers have observed that the use of homebrewers' glucoamylase has very little effect on the reduction of unfermentable sugars and have decided to stop using it altogether. It's suggested that you prepare a batch or two without using glucoamylase and compare the terminating gravity, Tg, explained in the chapter on fermentation, to the Tg of batches prepared with glucoamylase. If the glucoamylase is working well, you will observe a noticeably lower Tg when it is used. 95% sulfuric acid, H2SO4. 95% sulfuric acid is used to adjust the pH of the mash water downward. This is covered in the chapter on mashing. Very small amounts, in the order of 10 to 15 drops per 20 L, are ever used. Sulfuric acid is an extremely dangerous and corrosive strong acid and should not, under any circumstances, come into contact with any part of the body or clothing. It should always be stored in a tightly closed container, out of the reach of children. Furthermore, it should only be handled by persons suitably schooled in laboratory procedures for handling strong acids. If you are not comfortable with the idea of handling strong acids, citric or tartaric acid, available at home winemaking supply shops, is perfectly harmless and not poisonous, and can be used with acceptable results. However, since they are weak acids, more will be required to achieve the same pH lowering results. If using sulfuric acid, it should be the common commercial grade available from chemical suppliers as 95% H2SO4, not battery acid used in the automotive industry. Automotive battery acid contains depolarizing agents and other toxic compounds. Also, it's typically only about 5% H2SO4. Calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Calcium carbonate, aka precipitated chalk, is used to adjust the pH of the mash water upward. This is covered in the chapter on mashing. Calcium carbonate can be purchased at home brewers' supply shops or at chemical suppliers. Mashing is the biochemical process where starches are converted to sugars. Starches are long chains of sugar, glucose, molecules connected by ether linkages. An ether linkage is where two sugar molecules join together and one water molecule is removed. In mashing, enzymes cause water molecules to be reintroduced to the ether linkages, thereby breaking them and freeing the individual sugars from the chains. This process of breaking the ether linkages is called hydrolysis. The term starch refers to a family of molecules, all of which are chains of sugars. Some starches are chains of as many as 400 sugar molecules, and others are chains of as few as 4 sugar molecules. Shorter chain starches are soluble in water. Longer chain starches are insoluble in water. The mashing process is comprised of 2 phases, liquefaction and saccharification. The liquefaction phase involves the action of alpha-amylase enzymes reducing the longer chain insoluble starches to shorter chain soluble starches. Hence, liquefying. The second phase, saccharification, involves the action of beta-amylase enzymes reducing the shorter chain soluble starches to sugar molecules. In the production of grain liquors, the starches are supplied by the grains being mashed, e.g. corn, rye, millet, wheat, etc. Grains are, for the most part, made up of starch, protein, and fiber. Although different grains are comprised of slightly different proportions of starch, protein, and fiber, they are all roughly 50% starch. And mashing acts on that 50% starch. Malted grains, e.g. corn malt, rye malt, barley malt, supply the enzymes used for the production of grain liquors. Barley malt is by far the most widely used, and is the choice in this text. There are laboratory enzyme preparations available for mashing, but they are most commonly used in very large-scale alcohol production. These laboratory enzymes will not be discussed here, with the exception of glucoamylase, discussed in the chapter on ingredients. For malt enzymes to work properly, there are certain optimum conditions that are important to observe. These conditions are as follows. Mash water. The water used must be very nearly devoid of iron. A high iron content will denature, i.e. destroy, the enzymes. However, a fairly high calcium content, 50 to 250 ppm, is beneficial to the subsequent fermentation and the resulting flavor of the finished whiskey. Sulfates are preferable to carbonates and bicarbonates, but all are acceptable in the process. If suitable source water is not available, you can use deionized or distilled water. The addition of 10 milliliters, 2 teaspoons of gypsum, calcium sulfate, CaSO4, per 20 L is beneficial if using pure water. pH. Unless you have an accurate pH meter, it's very difficult to measure the pH of the mash after the grain has been added. Most people use pH papers and, for all practical purposes, pH papers can only be used to measure the pH of the mash water before the grain is added. Because the addition of the grain to the mash water will cause the pH of the mash water to go down slightly, combined with the fact that the conversion process itself results in a slight lowering of pH, it is best to establish a mash water pH on the high side of optimum, say 5.8 or 6.0. Measuring pH. To measure the pH of the mash water, thoroughly rinse a clean shot glass in the water to be measured. Draw off a small sample of the water in the shot glass, say 2 milliliters. Cut a 1.5 cm, 3/4 strip of pH paper, of whichever range is required, and place it in the 2 milliliters sample. Allow the pH paper to steep in the water sample for a few minutes to enable the indicator to mix with the water and change color. Hold the shot glass up to the light and compare the color with the color table on the pH paper packaging and determine the pH of the water. Adjusting pH, a pH of 5.8 to 6.0 should be established for the mash water. It is very rare that the pH of the source water is too low and requires adjusting upward. However, if this is necessary, calcium carbonate, CaCO3, aka precipitated chalk, should be used to raise the pH. CaCO3 should be used in comparatively small additions since a relatively small amount will raise the pH a surprisingly large amount. As is the condition with most source waters, the pH will likely need to be reduced. Since sulfates are notionally more beneficial to mashing than other radicals, 95% sulfuric acid, H2SO4, should be used 1 drop at a time to lower the pH. As a general guideline, 20 L of source water at pH 8.5 would take about 11 drops of 95% H2SO4 to reduce the pH to 5.8. Warning: see 95% sulfuric acid in the chapter on ingredients for important information about safety and alternatives for sulfuric acid. In order to avoid overshooting the target pH, it's useful to add the CaCO3 or H2SO4 in small incremental additions, taking measurements after each addition until the target pH is achieved. Temperature. The optimum temperature range for alpha-amylase enzymes, liquefying enzymes, is from 67 oC to 71 oC, 152 of to 160 of. The optimum temperature range for beta-amylase enzymes, saccharifying enzymes, is from 60 oC to 66 oC, 140 of to 151 of. Since a temperature that favors alpha-amylase activity, 67-71 oC, 152-160 of, tends to produce a mash with a high proportion of unfermentable sugars, i.e. dextrins and polysaccharides, and tends to denature beta-amylase enzymes, it is best to hold to temperatures in the range that favors beta-amylase activity, 60 oC, 66 oC, 140-151 of. The alpha-amylase will work at the lower temperatures, just not as fast as it would in its optimum range. If the mashing apparatus, or the mashing quantity, is capable of holding a single temperature constantly for 60 to 90 minutes, then 63 oC, 145 of, is the optimum conversion temperature. In fact, many commercial whiskey distilleries use 63 oC, 145 of, as their conversion temperature. On the other hand, if one is using a more rudimentary mashing apparatus, such as a large pot on a kitchen stove, then it is better to establish a conversion temperature of 65.5 oC, 150 of. During the 60 to 90 minute conversion rest, the temperature will slowly cool to about 60 oC, 140 of, thereby keeping the temperature within the optimum range throughout the conversion cycle. It's important to note that a mash at 71 oC, 160 of, or higher will rapidly denature the enzymes and may result in an incomplete conversion. Also, a large proportion of the resulting sugars would be unfermentable. And as a final note, a mash temperature of 75.5 oC, 168 of, or higher will instantly denature the enzymes. In fact, heating a mash to 75.5 oC, 168 of, after conversion is complete, is regularly done in the commercial brewing industry to mash out or halt all enzyme activity. Iodine starch test. After the 90-minute, or longer, conversion rest, the starches will be completely converted to sugars. This can be tested for by means of an iodine starch test. After the conversion rest, there will be a clear light yellow liquid about 7 or 8 centimeters, 3-inch, deep on top of the mash. Using the floating thermometer, carefully dab a few drops of this clear yellow liquid on a white porcelain saucer or plate, taking care to avoid getting any of the mash solids suspended below the clear liquid in the sample. Dab a drop or two of tincture of iodine into the sample on the porcelain saucer or plate. If there is any starch at all in the sample will turn an inky blue as soon as the iodine contacts it. If there is no starch, the sample will stay more or less the color of the iodine. You may observe tiny granular dots of blue in the sample when the iodine is added. This is not an indication of starch, but a result of cellulose from tiny particles of mash solids suspended in the sample. Iodine turns a dark blue, almost black, in the presence of cellulose in water. This is why you should take care to avoid getting the mash solids in the sample. Anyway, this cellulose indication can be ignored, and you can conclude there are no residual starches in the mash. When the iodine starch test is complete, discard the sample. Do not attempt to return it to the mash. Enjoy! Moonshine Life Recipes.